The next movement that I would like to talk about with you begins on page 185 of the lecture outline that I'm using here. And this is process thought, or process theology. This takes us a little bit further back in our history. I have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century to make sense out of this. But this is a movement that's still with us, and it continues to exert influence, and it's best that I take it as a unit, not a little bit of it, contemporary with Barth, and another little bit of it contemporary with Tillich, and so on and so forth. Just take the whole thing, start from 1910 or whenever it was, and take it till now. It's been around, I guess, basically for about 100 years. So, look on page 185, process philosophy. Some of the major figures, Samuel Alexander was the first of the process philosophers. He wrote a book called Space, Time, and Deity. At least he was the first one that became famous. And another man came after him who eventually surpassed him, became better known than Alexander, and that was Alfred North Whitehead. Now, we'll see the name of Whitehead again later on in the course, where we talk about Whitehead's collaboration with Bertrand Russell on an important book called Principia Mathematica back in the beginnings of analytic language philosophy. But for now, that happened before Whitehead became a process thinker. But for now, we talk about Whitehead as a process philosopher. Paul Weiss was a student of Whitehead. I studied with him at Yale. Charles Hartshorne was one of the people who was most influential in putting process philosophy into theological terms, because here, we have a bridge between philosophy and theology. We have process philosophy and we have process theology. Some of Whitehead's main contentions: first, he attacks what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which he defines as taking an abstraction as if it were a concrete entity. For example, when Descartes spoke of the mind and spoke of the matter, okay, we use the word mind and we use the word matter, but does that mean that mind is a thing, or that matter is a thing, and they can kind of bump up against one another in the body? Remember Descartes' argument about the pineal gland, that they can sort of bump up against one another in the pineal gland a little bit. Whitehead says, wait a minute, sure, we use the word mind and the word matter, but we shouldn't assume that these are completely separate and distinct from one another. They interact, they penetrate, they shade off into one another. Whitehead opposes isolating facts from concepts, the way a lot of philosophers have said the fact is what's out there and then the concept is what's in my mind. But can we really separate them so sharply? Berkeley, you remember, said we can't identify anything outside of our own mind. Kant and others, the idealist tradition in philosophy, tended to absorb facts to ideas. Maybe they kind of shade off into one another. Whitehead said we shouldn't assume that we have to understand present facts as separate from past facts and future facts. Maybe there's a kind of process that unites those all together. Four, he opposes the idea of atomism, the idea that you can separate everything into the smallest possible constituents and then understand those constituents by themselves without relating them to other things without relating the part to the whole. That's interesting because Whitehead's own philosophy at one time could be described as a logical atomism, and I think in a way his process philosophy is also a form of atomism, but we'll talk about that as we get to it. The actual object of all perception, he says, is an event intimately connected with a complex, ordered environment. In other words, in real life, everything is connected. Everything is kind of moves into everything else. But now that's not too much help. I mean, that gives us a vision of everything flowing into everything, kind of a process world. The word process conjures up something like that. It's a little bit like Heraclitus's idea of everything changing. But now we need to get more precise about what the world is like. Whitehead, first of all, is an atomist in the sense that he's going to try to distinguish the most fundamental constituents of reality. But we have to remind ourselves that after he does that, he's going to say that these constituents shade off into other things, that they're not easy to isolate from other realities. The most fundamental constituents of the universe, says Whitehead, may be called events or occasions or actual entities. All right? These are spatiotemporal occurrences which enter into transactions of various sorts with other events. Now you'll notice what he's doing here. What the Greek atomists did was to chop up things into little pieces of matter. But Whitehead's atoms are not pieces of matter. Whitehead's atoms are pieces of time, if you will, pieces of the space-time continuum. They are events, they are occasions, they are things that happen. And these are all bound together in one unified process, but they all have relationships to one another. Each event prehends the others. Now, here's the way he does this, and I know those of you who are listening on the audio won't be able to see me put this on the board, but I'm putting a little kind of tall rectangular things on the board, a series of them, some of them higher up and some of them are lower. And this is a temporal sequence. So you got one of them, and then you got the next one, and then you got the next one, and so on. And each one of these I would call an actual occasion or an event in Whitehead's terms. And each of these exists for maybe 3 seconds. It's kind of funny, the process philosophers actually argue among themselves as to how long an actual occasion lasts. But that's a significant discussion because it's not as though these are momentary. They actually do last for a period of time. They are part of the spatial temporal complex. They last for a period of time. And they take one another into account. This one takes this one into account, and this one takes this one into account. See, the present ones take the past ones into account, and so on. He uses the word prehend for taking account of. You know, we have the words comprehend and apprehend. This is just prehend, okay? I remember, I think George Goebel made that dates me, right, made a joke where he said, it's not that I was overwhelmed, and he said, it's not that I was underwhelmed, let's just say that I was whelmed, okay? So not apprehend and not comprehend, but just plain prehend. Okay, so each of these prehends the others, all right? The present the present occasion prehends the past ones. Now, human knowledge is one form of prehension. That is, for me to say this is occasion A, this is occasion B, and I'm occasion B, and how do I, for me to know occasion A is to prehend occasion B. Knowledge is one form of prehension. Each event is objectively immortal within the time-space continuum. All right, now these come into being and then disappear. That's the way the process works. This comes into being and disappears, and then this one comes into being and disappears, and this one comes into being and disappears. So it is a sequence. It's a temporal sequence, and yet, if you look at it in four-dimensional space, it will always be the case. Let's say this one comes into being at 2 o'clock, and this one comes into being at 2:03, and this one comes into being at 2:06. It will always be the case that at 2:03 on this date, occasion B was in existence. See, that's an eternal truth. The eternal truth that at 2:03, see, when I have to index it according to time, that at 2:03, actual occasion B was in being. Okay, so each event, that's what we mean by saying that each event is objectively immortal within the space-time continuum. Now, each event has two poles, all right? I'll divide each one of these into two by putting a line through the middle of it. And let's say the bottom half I'll call physical. I'll put a P in the bottom half. And then the top half I'll put M for mental. So each of these is part physical, part mental. And the physical pole is, it prehends past occasions. And indeed, the physical pole is predetermined, okay? Each of these is predetermined as to its physical makeup. But the mental pole is absolutely free in the libertarian sense. The mental pole is creative, the mental pole is free, the mental pole is non-determined, okay? So, the picture that keeps recurring to me is the picture of human life. I think what Whitehead is doing is he's drawing a very close analogy between the smallest constituents of the world and human beings. He's saying, well, if human beings are the way they are, then the world must be similar. I'm not persuaded by that. I don't think that's right, but I think that's what he's saying. And human beings, you know, we are born, we have this physical nature, right, that we inherit from our parents. And we can't choose that we're determined. Some people are born with only one arm. Well, they can't help that. It's not an act of will, it's something that they're born with. Some people are born black, some are born white, some are born male, some are born female, some are born to be good basketball players, some are born to be scholars. So you just can't you can't help it. I mean, there's some things that you just can't help. That's your physical side. But you can help what you do with your physical side, okay? That's your mental pole, all right? You can choose what education to have. You can choose where to spend your time. You can choose what to do. So this is, the physical pole is nature. The mental pole is nurture. all right? Part of who you are consists of your body. Part of it consists of your free choices and your mental thoughts. Now, the physical pole prehends the past physical pole, just as we prehend our parents, all right? Our parents make us what we are physically. But then our mind chooses what to prehend, all right? So let's say that with my mind I decide, hey, I'd like to study Elizabethan history, okay? Well, that's a choice that I make. And I go back and I look at some of these actual occasions that were present during the time of Elizabeth I, and I go back and I consult those and study those and find out what happened and let myself be changed, let myself be inspired by the events of that time, and so on and so forth. So that's my memory. Another thing I can do, so I can choose to prehend some things in the past. There's another thing I can prehend, all right? And that is, there's a whole other realm here, a realm above. And you can think of this realm as Plato's forms, okay? These are what Whitehead calls the eternal objects. And these are very much like Plato's forms. This is the ideal triangle, the ideal steer, the ideal chicken, the ideal warrior, the ideal musician, and so on, ideal goodness. And you may, now the thing is, these eternal objects do not have reality. Plato thought that they had, well, reality is not quite the word. Plato thought that these eternal objects were the most real things that there are. Whitehead says, yeah, they're knowable and they're maybe real in a sense, but they're not actual. See, these are the actualities, the actual occasions. These are the actualities. These are only possibilities. Perfect justice isn't found here in this world. There is no perfect justice, but it is a possibility. So maybe one of you says, I want to be president of the United States. And I want my administration to be the most just administration there could possibly be. So you choose to connect yourself up with the eternal object that's called justice. You prehend justice. And that means that you try to make yourself the most just person in the world. You study justice. You try to become more and more of a just person. And so that's what happens. And I think what Whitehead is saying is that, I've been using examples from human life here, but Whitehead is saying it's not only human beings that are like that. It's not only human beings that are part physical and part mental. It's not just human beings who go back and study history. It's not just human beings that go up and look at the eternal objects. But it's also every single little fragment of reality is like that. The whole spatio-temporal cycle is made up of one of these after another. And they are all material. They are all mental. So Whitehead is remember that term? Whitehead is a panpsychist. He believes that everything thinks. He believes that mind is everywhere. He doesn't think that all is mind like the idealists do, but he believes that everything thinks, that everything has a mental aspect. And so this is the nature of human life. This is the nature of human experience. he analogizes that this is also the nature of reality. This is the nature of rocks. This is the nature of trees. Rocks are made up of many thousands, many millions, many billions of these actual occasions. And they too are partly physical, partly mental. There is a physical side and there is a mental side. So we're getting to look at Whitehead's universe. So you have this world then. You have actual entities. You have eternal objects. And remember, the actual entities are, in a way, everything that there is. Because the eternal objects are only possibilities. They become actual when they come into my life, when they inspire an actual entity. But you have these two modes of being. You have the actual entities, you have the eternal objects, and then you have a third mode of being called God. Okay? And what is God for Whitehead? Well, his early doctrine, bottom of the page, God is the ground of rationality. But if he's the ground of rationality, he must himself be irrational. So God is kind of this buzzing, blooming principle of creativity and contingency that kind of brings change to everything, all right? But later on in Whitehead's writings, he argued that God is a concrete entity who includes the world but also transcends the world. This doctrine is called panentheism. Remember, pantheism means that God is the world and the world is God. Panentheism means that the world is in God, although God is more than the world. Okay, so every one of us is a part of God. Every one of us is divine. But there's something about God that goes beyond us and goes beyond earthly realities and goes beyond the actual occasions. Okay? Now, what does God do? God chooses the actual occasions according to their initial aim, all right? That is the physical pole, but he does not determine their creative decisions. Now remember, every actual occasion has a physical pole and a mental pole. God predetermines the physical pole, all right? So I told you earlier that we get our physical side from our parents and so on and so forth from that causal process. And God is the name for the total causal process. All the things that go into making me who I am can be called God. And all the things that go into making each one of these actual occasions what it is, each one of those, it's called God. So God chooses the actual occasions according to their physical pole. He also uses the phrase initial aim. But he does not determine their creative decisions. That is, he doesn't govern their mental pole. God also limits what is possible. He limits the possibilities, what we've called the eternal objects, and he orders them. And he makes it possible for actual occasions to prehend eternal objects. He creates a connection there for that to happen. So he sort of facilitates all of this. He sort of lies behind all of this and sort of greases the skids. I've never figured out why we have to have God in order to do these things, according to Whitehead, but Whitehead is drawn to the concept of God. And so God kind of makes it feasible, makes it possible for all these things to happen. Now, what kind of a being is God? We saw earlier that each of the actual occasions has two aspects, the physical aspect and the mental aspect. Similarly, God has two aspects, which Whitehead calls the primordial and the consequent. Primordial and consequent. The primordial nature of God, from the theistic proofs we can determine that a God like this must exist in any possible world. God's primordial nature includes those attributes which pertain to any deity in any possible world. Okay, so his primordial nature includes his ability to include all of this stuff. It includes his ability to foreordain the physical poles. That's quite a bit of power. It includes his ability to order the eternal objects. Those are the things that are provided by the primordial nature of God. But now the consequent nature of God. In our world, God has definite attributes and a definite character. We say that God is love. We say that God is wise. That character is produced not only by the functions which he performs, but especially by his interaction with the particular universe. So, there's some attributes that God has simply by being God. And those are the attributes that obtain in any universe. Regardless of what the universe is like, God would be the same. So these are the attributes that are eternal, unchangeable, we might say, abstract. But the consequent nature, these are the attributes that he picks up through his interaction with the world, so that God is affected by the world. God affects the world, and the world affects him. There is a kind of reciprocity, a kind of correlativity between God and the world. So God is a God who responds to things. Now we often say that God has everything planned out and so on. But in process philosophy, God doesn't have everything all planned out. There's a very strong doctrine of free will in process philosophy. And God doesn't have control over free will. God doesn't have control over the mental side. And so all he can do is sort of watch while creatures make their own decisions. And when creatures make their own decisions, of course, that means that maybe he has to change in some way. He has to adapt to the new conditions. He has to do something new. So God himself is changing in the process. He responds to the actual entities. He responds to the eternal objects. So although God is absolutely necessary being, he's also dependent on the world for his concrete nature. Without the world, he would be abstract. He would have no definite character. With the world, he is relative to the world. Charles Hartshorne, let me share with you one argument that Hartshorne uses, because Hartshorne is a little bit more geared to theologians and to theological language. What Hartshorne says is, what kind of God do you want to believe in? I mean, God is the highest being, right? Anselm says that God is that than which no greater can be conceived. And so God is the highest being that any of us can imagine. Well, what kind of a being is that? What kind of a being has all perfections? Traditionally, the highest being is unchanging, unchangeable, omniscient, omnipresent, and so on. But Hartshorne says, wait, think about this a little bit. If you look at the scale of being here in your experience, a rock is not very high on the scale of being. Rocks just sit there, right? Plants are a little bit higher than rocks because plants can adjust. Plants can move. A plant can turn to face the sun, or it can put down its roots in order to hit better soil or to get water. Still higher, but of course, a plant can't get up and walk around. A higher being would be like a fox. A fox can actually get up and walk around. If the sun's too hot, it can find shade. If it needs water, it can go over and get a drink, you see. So the higher you go on the scale, the more adjustable the being is. Now, when you get to human beings are the most adjustable of any form of life. You know, we are able to adjust in spades. We are able to adjust to circumstances by putting up houses and by making plans for the distant future and so on and so forth. We can, we have such dominion over the earth because we're able to adjust to so many different things. We're able to prepare for so many eventualities and change ourselves so that we can be ready for anything. So the rock doesn't adjust very much. The plant adjusts a little more. The animal adjusts still more. Human being adjusts still more. Now, what kind of if God is the highest being, God must be the most adjustable being there is, according to Hartshorne. God must be able to change according to everything that takes place, every little occasion, every detail of everything that happens. God adjusts to it. So God is not unchangeable. God is not asse, the attribute of aseity. God is not self-sufficient. God changes, God moves, God adjusts. And just as we respond to God, so God responds to us. And that's the fundamental picture of God in process philosophy and also in process theology. And I've given you the most basic picture of process philosophy. And I think that's all you need to have. The fact is, of course, that a lot of people have tried to adjust Christian theology to this notion of divine process. And I really don't think it works. Of course, what you have to do, if you're going to do that, is to eliminate any thought of divine predestination, divine sovereignty. And of course, you have to, there's no creation out of nothing. There is no creator in this process scheme. These things, these actual occasions, they pop up, and they've always been popping up. I mean, there's no beginning to this, and there's no end. So God is not the creator ex nihilo, and God is not the controller. God simply responds, sometimes helplessly, to the decisions that his creatures make. Very, very different from what you have in the Bible concerning the sovereignty of God. Another major difficulty here is how do you get the Trinity into it? And how do you get Jesus into it? How do you get redemption into it? Well, there's a lot of strain here when these process thinkers try to make room for orthodox theological commitments. And I just don't think they're ever very successful at it. And I think for the most part they're very, very unsuccessful and not very cogent about it. I do, though, want to talk about something on that's very much influenced, I think, by process philosophy, although it's not quite the same thing. And that is called Open Theism. I mentioned my own little book there. Open Theism comes out of, now process philosophy comes out of a secular philosophical orbit. And but open theism comes out of an evangelical background. It comes out of a background of some people who are steeped in Methodist theology, Arminian theology. And they're concerned with determining how God is sovereign in the light of human free will. There's a problem here. You see some of the figures, Gregory Boyd, Clark Pinnock, who died a few years ago, John Sanders, William Hasker, Richard Rice. These are people who come out of an evangelical background, but they're trying to do justice to the idea of free will. And as you might know, free will in the libertarian sense is very important to Arminian theology. What do I mean by libertarian freedom? I think I've defined that for you sometime in this course, but let me make sure we're on the same page here. Libertarian freedom means that when I make a choice, that choice is completely undetermined, or it can be. I mean, when I make a free choice, or not all my choices are free, but when I make a free choice, that choice is completely uncaused. It's undetermined. Nobody or no thing makes me choose the way I do. It's not caused by God. It's not caused by the character of my heart. It's not caused by my heredity or by my education or by my previous experiences. It's not even caused by my own desires, because even when I choose my strongest desire, if that's a free choice in this sense, if that's a libertarian free choice, then I could equally well have chosen the opposite. Okay, so my desire may incline me to choose something, but my desire never determines what I do. Well, this means that free choices are entirely uncaused. Now, if that's the case, there's a real problem for Arminian theology, because Arminian theology says, with the traditional view of the church, Arminian theology says that God knows everything, past, present, and future. Okay? Now, how can God know what is future when my choices are entirely free in the libertarian sense? Here I am, I'm holding a whiteboard marker, and I'm throwing the whiteboard marker into the air. If God knows the future, then God knew 30 years ago. Now, let's not talk about eternity past. Let's just talk about 30 years ago. God knew 30 years ago that I would be in this room and I would be throwing the marker into the air and catching it at this particular time of day. Now, if he knew that 30 years ago, was I free to throw the marker up in the air? Or was I free not to throw the marker up in the air? How can this be a free choice if God knew it beforehand? Because if God knew it, then it was unavoidable. If God knew it, it could, it had to happen, right? Well, how does that work? You know, if God knew it, it had to happen. And why did it have to happen? Calvinists would say it had to happen because, of course, God's eternal plan predetermined that it would happen. But Arminians don't believe in that. So how, if what God knows in the future inevitably happens, what makes it inevitable? From an Arminian point of view, it can't be God's eternal plan. It has to be something else. Maybe another God. Maybe maybe scientific cause and effect, but of course that would raise havoc with libertarian freedom, wouldn't it? So Arminianism has a real problem. How can my choice be free and God still know everything in the future? Well, the answer, if you struggle with that problem, you have two alternatives. One, you can become a Calvinist. Not too many of the Arminians want to become Calvinists. Or you can become an open theist. And the open theist says God does not know the future perfectly. All right? That seems like a drastic position to take. But some people have taken it, and they are called open theists. Greg Boyd, Clark Pinnock, John Sanders, William Hasker, and Richard Rice. Open theism goes together with some other things. I think this idea of God's foreknowledge, the limitations on God's foreknowledge, that's the central part of open theism. But let's listen to some of their other contentions. First, love is God's most important attribute. Second, love is not only care and commitment, but also being sensitive, responsive, and vulnerable. Okay? Don't really love somebody unless that person can wound you. Three, creatures exert an influence on God. That reminds us a little bit of process philosophy. Four, God's will is not the ultimate explanation of everything. History is the combined result of what God and his creatures decide to do. Five, God does not know everything timelessly, but from events as they take place. So God is not above time, God is in time, and he watches things as they happen. And he doesn't know things in advance, at least necessarily. He learns what happens as he watches it happen. Number six, so God does not know the future exhaustively. Well, you see under C, there's a bit of an exposition of libertarian freedom. Now, problems with open theism. And by the way, I've written about this extensively. I've written a book on open theism called No Other God. And I've written about some of these issues in my book called Doctrine of God. Two problems about this this view. Excuse me. First, libertarianism is unscriptural and incoherent. First, Scripture teaches that God controls everything that comes to pass. Many, many verses to that effect. But Ephesians 1:11 is important, that God works all things after the counsel of his own will. B, Scripture never suggests that man has libertarian freedom or anything like it. C, if our actions are not caused by our desires, then they are accidents, random happenings of no moral value. In other words, if I throw that marker up into the air when I didn't even want to, how can I be responsible for it? If I had no desire to do this, how can that be a moral action on my part? D, open theists say that libertarian freedom is the basis of moral responsibility. But courts assume, as they must, that responsible actions are sufficiently motivated. An uncaused action would not be a responsible action. Anything that you do randomly or without a cause can really not be held against you morally. I mean, if you walk in front of a bank and all of a sudden your legs just start moving and take you into the bank, and you know, your arms work against what you want them to do. They just of their own accord, they take a gun out of your pocket and point it at the teller, and you walk off with money. I mean, that's you'd probably be put in jail for that. But if you say, I didn't intend to do it, I didn't desire to do it, I didn't want to do it, if you're telling the truth, you're not morally to blame for that. It's some kind of a sickness, some kind of a mental condition, perhaps, that led you to do that. Well, so libertarian freedom is certainly not the basis of moral responsibility. Our moral responsibility is based on the fact that we're creatures of God, that we're in God's image, and that we're commanded to do his bidding. Secondly, according to Scripture, God has exhaustive foreknowledge. First, the nature of prophecy. Deuteronomy 18 says that if a prophet foretells that something will happen and it doesn't happen, he's not a true prophet. Now, that's assuming, of course, that the prophet is somebody who gets messages from God, and God knows perfectly well what's going to happen in the future. So the test of a prophet is also the test of God. In the 40s of Isaiah, you know, God challenges the false gods, and he says, let them tell what's going to happen in the future. They won't be able to do it. I am the true God because only I am able to foretell the future. The assumption, of course, of that is that God knows what's going to happen in the future. Then I think this is implicit in the biblical teaching that God has foreordained all things, Ephesians 1:11, but foreordained them by his wisdom. Psalm 104 says that all things, God has made all things by his wisdom, not just made all things, but made all things according to a wise plan. And if he's done that, then of course everything is something that he has planned out and thought ahead about. And then there are many explicit statements about God's foreknowledge, like Psalm 139, that God knew who I was when he was planting me in my mother's womb. Many other passages along those lines. Now, the open theists would say there are also some statements in the Bible that suggest that God is ignorant. For example, in Genesis 3:9, God comes to Adam and Eve in the garden, and he says, Adam, where art thou? Or Adam, where are you? And the open theists say that suggests that God doesn't know where Adam is. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that that's wrong. I mean, clearly God does know where Adam is. God asks where he is in order to get Adam to answer, in order to get Adam to give an account of himself. In Genesis 11:5, God says, let us go down to Babel, where they're putting up the tower, to see if their sin is the way we have heard it is. And of course he finds that it is, and so God breaks down the tower and scatters them throughout the face of the earth. Again, I think there God is not expressing ignorance. God is gathering together an indictment. He's gathering together evidence of their sin to bring it against him in a public confrontation. So there are a number of ways to respond to those kinds of statements. The same thing for passages where God says in Jeremiah 7:31 and elsewhere, where God says that the idea of human sacrifice never entered my mind. Does that mean that God was ignorant about human sacrifice? No. God forbade human sacrifice back in the book of Deuteronomy, and certainly God knew that it was wrong before he told the people that they shouldn't do it. But this simply means that human sacrifice is entirely contrary to God's standards. Then number 3, on an open theist view, God is not reliable. He makes mistakes. Gregory Boyd tells a story about a woman named Suzanne who gets into a lot of trouble. Boyd is evidently counseling Suzanne, and Suzanne gets in a lot of trouble because she believes that God has promised blessing in her life if she does this and that, and she does everything, and her life is under a curse. Many terrible things happen. And, you know, if I were counseling Suzanne, I'd try to say, well, you know, you shouldn't be so sure that God is talking to you in those situations. But what Boyd does is, Boyd, the open theist, Boyd says, well, yes, God did tell you, God did promise blessing, but God didn't know in advance what was going to happen to you. And so God couldn't know whether you'd receive blessing or not. So because God doesn't know the future, God sometimes makes mistakes in the counsel that he gives to people. God sometimes misleads. Well, I think that's a very wrong view to hold, and I think it's a very dangerous view to hold. And of course, that raises questions about the authority of the Bible, because the Bible consists of God's guidance. And if God doesn't know what the future will bring, how do we know that God has guided us rightly on the pages of Scripture?